Hey everyone, Stiga here, and welcome back to the city of Hunterville in City Skylines. In the last episode, we worked on the city's main hospital complex and did some residential expansion, and in today's episode we're going to continue with a residential area set around the railway line. And to start off with, we're coming through here and upgrading this main road to have some bicycle lanes on it. I set up this road in Road Builder and then just upgraded that road there. And then now we're coming through and expanding out the road network. And this kind of needs to work around some constraints, one of them being the railway line, which runs through this area and follows the bottom of the hills due to needing to achieve a reasonable gradient of 1%. And we're also adding in a road on top of the little ridge line there, and then this main road that also follows the railway line. And then here coming through and adjusting this curve to kind of make things marry up a little bit better between those two roads. And I'd say they're the main roads of this area, and now we're coming through adding this one more road, and the area to the bottom of that road will be blank for the time being, as we'll come through in the next episode and expand the main park area onto the other side of the main road. But also it will have this little street that jots into it. But I did take a while to kind of figure out the general road layout of this area, as it's not exactly square and there's a few curves and odd shapes. And this was the area I was really struggling with. I think earlier I tried making the streets go all the way to the other side and had some weird curvy things going on. But now we're just coming back through and making a few parallel roads, and then there'll be this empty space here which has a cul-de-sac to complete the awkwardly shaped area. And then we're moving over to the intersection of the main road that runs alongside the city park and the other main road leading into this suburb area. And at this intersection we've got bike lanes on both sides of the road, on this road at the bottom here, and then a bi-directional bicycle lane on the top of the T, and trying to connect that all up. I also added in a little curb island at the top of the intersection to try and discourage cars from driving in it if they were to do that for some reason, and then coming through and setting up the timed traffic lights. At this intersection, I set up the signal phasing to have the pedestrians run in a separate phase, and at the same time also the bicycles run in that phase. Not sure how I feel about that. And for the rest of the intersection, just set up regular T intersection phasing with the opposing movements running, and since there's no pedestrians, also having any other left turns and such running at the same time, since we can achieve that. And then we're moving over to expanding out the residential areas. Here, this suburb's kind of going to be like an interwar sort of 1920s, 1930s style suburb. So using some like older bungalow homes there, and then moving on to some slightly newer model homes with a bit more selection of like Art Deco and just different types of homes to try and change it up and not make every suburb look the same. And working at the head of this cul-de-sac here, just adding a few homes, and in the sort of awkwardly spaced areas, I'm also using the backlot sections that I created, which are just 2-3 deep homes that still connect up to the roadway, and using them to fill in the empty space a bit more. And then to fill in the rest of that space, the typical trick I used is just adding a lot of trees everywhere to try and fill in those last little gaps. And now we're moving into the main road to start adding down buildings and things. The length of the commercial area I have put aside for shops and things is around 300 meters, so on either side of the road. And to start off with, we're placing down the police station, which is the sort of green roofed building on the right hand side. Just thought that would help anchor this area a little bit, and then otherwise just coming through with a variety of single-story and two-story shops and pubs and other buildings. And I'm trying to be a little bit selective about what sorts of buildings I'm using here for the general aesthetic of the area to match in with the sort of age of the homes here and everything else, and also just so that they actually all fit together nicely in these areas, as sometimes you end up with a building and it's like half the building width length too wide or something, and it doesn't quite all work together very well. But yeah, mixing it up between different buildings so it's not too repetitive. And in this block in particular, I used one building that is an Art Deco style building based off one in Napier, New Zealand, and just mixing that in here with some of these other shops. Most of them are just plain shops with a shop sign, or some don't even have that much. But I managed to get away in most of these areas without using procedural objects much. I did in some cases just to change the size of the building slightly so it fit the space better, but yeah, keeping that to a minimum. And here's just a few more shops, and this is the section of the road closest to the rail line, and we're pretty much done placing down the shops on this side of the road now, just trying to find some on the corners and being a bit picky about what I select out there, as they are sort of one of the main focal points when you're taking cinematics or even just driving down the street, etc. You do notice the ones on the corners quite a bit more from various different angles. And now with the buildings positioned, we're coming through and detailing around the back of all these shops. Right here I'm placing down a little car park, as this is directly behind that police station, so put a few prop police cars there in the back alley. And then we're also coming through and adding some dumpsters in this area, and I also added roadwear decals on the service lanes to make them look a bit more used and a bit less plain, and then putting some tables and things out the front of this shop, and continuing and going around and adding dumpsters and things behind these shops. And while we're doing that, I think this is a good opportunity to talk about a bit more about the background of this suburb. So my thinking is that this suburb was perhaps sort of loosely founded around the 1920s, immediately around the railway line, as that provides good connections to the downtown of Hunterville city, and from there it's gradually expanded, most of the expansion being sort of in maybe the 30s or 20s or sometime around then anyway. And then eventually it's expanded to just be part of the main city rather than a standalone town. And then behind this row of shops is where the first housing development was established, and that is the section closest to the railway line, so it makes sense developing around the railway line. And then further out from that, other things have expanded in the future decades and joined up with the town. And I imagine that the suburb too might have had a tram line run through it at one point, having been extended out from the main core of Hunterville. But like many cities in the US, Australia, etc., including New Zealand, they were disestablished in the 1950s or so in favour of car-based transport and more traffic lanes and things. And since then, the town, suburb, sort of town centre area has still grown along that street, but has led a slightly different form, and most of the sort of town centre buildings I imagine would have also been developed around that sort of 1920s or 1930s time, in line with the suburban expansion. And now we're working on the other side of the road. The first thing I did here was add a low-rise apartment building, as we are still relatively close to the city, this corridor is going to be served by a bus line at some point when I get around to doing that, as well as it's quite close to the railway line, so it makes sense that there might be a handful of apartment buildings along this corridor, as it's a reasonably close-in suburb and would have been accessible by many different ways. And here we're just coming through and adding more buildings along the corridor, just sort of trying to work out how to fit these all. I skipped over this one, but here we've changed the shape of the building completely with procedural objects, but I didn't include that in the time lapse. And now just coming behind this apartment building and adding in some car parking for the residents, since there's no like underground parking garage for that apartment building. So they just get to make use of this back alley for their parking needs. I don't even know if the car parking ratio works to the numbers of apartments in that building, but it doesn't matter. And also doing a little loading dock for this other building back here. Anyway, now since we continue with the back alleys, I think it would be a good chance to discuss the areas that I was referencing for this suburb. And the primary location was the suburb of Papataitai in Auckland. This is sort of a railway suburb that first developed around the railway and then has expanded out and since become part of the wider urbanised area of Auckland. But I think it was a good reference to the suburb in Hunterville, as they kind of stem from similar beginnings, that being a railway suburb. But also this suburb, I didn't do it intentionally, but it ended up having probably a little bit too similar of a road layout to Papataitai, like with the slightly angled roads coming off the main road. But that's just something that ended up happening because of the topography and things in this area in Hunterville. Anyway, the suburb is quite large in Hunterville, so will probably become like a key destination for some of the surrounding areas, plus I don't know how far it will be to the next town centre as I keep on building out the city. And here we're coming through and just doing a little bit more detailing, adding some graffiti props and things on the walls here. That's something that I sometimes forget to do in this series. And then moving over to near this signalised intersection, which is of the main road through the suburb, but there's also another main road that connects to the next suburb over the river. So just wanted to extend the commercial areas out to this area and thought that would be a good place to leave it. And just doing a little bit of detailing behind this building with some dumpsters and some roadwear decals. I did add that coffee kiosk there on the other side of the road, and here we're adding in another apartment building as it's still on that same sort of high demand corridor for public transport and things, but probably is a little bit further from the train station in comparison. And in this little awkward space, I just added one townhouse building to try and fill it up. It probably could have been like a parking lot or something for the apartment building if I had a thought about it a bit more. And then coming through for the final section of shops on the street, and I just picked out that 3-story one to give it a bit of a difference from the rest of the area, which is only 1 or 2 stories, and just have one building that stands out a bit more. And I also added that hotel building. I wanted to add it on the main street, but after sort of placing that down, I realized that probably wasn't going to work, and put it on the other side of that street right up against the railway line. And then also added another apartment building in there too. And now coming through and working on this back alley, this one is a little bit harder to work with as there's more terrain differences going on in this section than there were in the other blocks. And I also added in one more shop over the back just to make the entrance to that alleyway a little bit tighter. And here coming through and adding in some parking spaces. and the typical treatment of dumpsters and weird decals and other things. And in this section here, it becomes apparent pretty quickly the terrain differences when you see the parking lot not really showing up there. So just came through and did some adjusting to the terraforming network to try and make that all work and have these parking spaces out the back. And yeah, just a few roadway decals, and then we have to try and overcome whatever's going on with the terrain at the back of this building. I selected the approach of using the ploppable surface and just using that there to try and marry up the levels, but it doesn't look very great. And the final bit is more roadway decals, and then we're going to move over to working on a park just at the back of this block. So coming through and setting up the pathways. At this park, as you can see with the contours, there's a big low point around this area, and instead of trying to flatten it out, I just decided to keep it like that, and that low point could be used as like a stormwater retention basin. And just coming through and adding in some playground structures and props and things, a little slide and things to sort of anchor this part of the park, and then coming through with some trees and things just to fill that all up. And this is really the only section of this park which has anything of note. The rest is just largely trees, and then that low point has a slightly different approach to how I went about the vegetation in that area. Just smaller bushes and some sort of grass tufts in this area, so you can see me coming around adding in these smaller bushes. I did put a few trees around the edges just to sort of make it seem as though the higher points there is a bit more going on, and then just dotting some bushes down here and coming through in a second with these lawn tufts and just placing them around. It kind of looks quite nice when you look at it from certain angles. There's just all this grass and things going on. And then to finish off this space, we're just coming through with a few more bushes and trees and things on this corner, and then a final more open section just with some trees in a big long line to form the border of this space. And that is the park completed. So now we've completed the town centre, and make sure to leave a comment and share your ideas about the area. And now we're moving over to more residential expansion. This area is sort of on the top of a ridgeline of a hill, so going for a cul-de-sac road there, and then just adding a few houses around the edge of the cul-de-sac. And then moving to the bottom of this hillside, we're creating houses with backlots, and I'm using the terraforming network here to try and make the driveways seem somewhat consistent gradient. And then moving over to expanding out this area, I skipped over a bit of it, but there's one section that has like maybe 5 or 6 houses all connecting from this one road here. And then we're coming through with these grassy rock props and placing them down, and then just doing a little bit more vegetation and tree detailing around the place. And then I think I largely skipped over a lot of the suburban expansion as it's very repetitive otherwise. I found this bit kind of interesting though, since we're dealing with terrain differences and things. But overall we did do quite a large amount of residential expansion, but I'm not showing all of that here. I'm just showing a couple of these rectangular blocks as well. Just going through and placing down some homes. Some of them have backlots, although in this section right here, it's just not deep enough the block depth to achieve that. And then we're going to move over to placing down the train station in a second, once we've added this little bit in. So I just went for a 2-platform train station. In this location, I went for an island type platform rather than having just the 2 tracks in the middle with side islands. And then coming along here and just reconfiguring some of the train line that connects up to here, and then also creating the single tracked sections. For this, I use the network multi-tool as the track kind of needs to diverge due to the island platform being in the middle. And then now we're moving over to the other side of the railway line and now extending this track up through this mountainside. My thoughts are for this section of track that it is the older route that goes over the hill here and just kind of winds its way up through here. There's a little flat area up at the sort of top of the hill where in the future I am thinking of doing a suburb up here, which is just there at the end of the track there, but that's coming in the future. And anyway, at that location I was aiming for about a 2% gradient on the rail tracks. I know that is a bit steep. I understand that sometimes in the olden days they would kind of aim for 1%, which is very flat to walk on, but trains need very gentle gradients. But I was looking around in the Johnsonville line in Wellington, which is the old rail alignment for the railway line out of Wellington, does have a similar gradient, potentially a bit steeper, but the 2% worked in this case in Hunterville, kind of balancing that realism with the constrained environment and the fact that we also need to think about just scaling things down a bit in City Skylines to make it all sort of work out and not have a super huge city. But anyway, it all worked out. And then I'm also going to go through off camera in this episode and actually add in like a big rail deviation that goes through a tunnel through the hills, but I'm not showing that on camera in this episode as there was really just more trial and error tinkering and it's not all that interesting. It's just a railway line. Anyway, here we're now moving through the time-lapse pretty quickly. I added in this bridge here using the intersection marking tool to do the entire bridge structure basically just with props rather than using individual props and different things and that way. And I found that worked out pretty okay here. And then we're coming through, since this area's on quite a bit of a slope from the ground level below it, we're coming through with the slope networks, and I opted for a concrete style slope rather than a sort of grass slope here since it's just slightly too steep. I think you'd probably aim for about 1 in 3 slope for grass, whereas this ends up being about 1 in 2 or something like that, so just a little bit steep. And to kind of sell that here, we're adding in these decals to show that it's been created by blockwork rather than by just simple pavement and things. And then also going through and adding these little tufts in here just to the way that the decals were working. I did a lot of procedural objects and there were these sort of grey patches where the decals didn't quite line up properly, so yeah, went through and added bushes there to try and make it all look like maybe this is just a bit worn down over time and there's been some sort of dirt and things that have accumulated in the expansion joints and various other cracks that have appeared over time. And now we've almost got to the end of building this area out to the entrance to the train station, and this train station is probably going to serve 2 lines. So there's the line that we built that goes up the hill, and that will probably be like some local suburban line that just goes to the suburbs up there on the old alignment. And then there's also another railway line that continues along the floodplains alongside the river and just keeps on extending out through there. And then they will connect through, at least one of those lines is going to go in the underground rail tunnel that we've got in the center of the city, and the other line either will go to other suburbs or go to the rail terminal or maybe go in the underground trench as well. I'm not sure yet, I haven't figured that out. But we also added in a little pathway at the entrance to the railway station, and then coming over to this other side of the bridge and just kind of tidying this area up a little bit as there was some terrain things that needed sorting out. And then for the last little section of this episode, I wanted to expand out on the other side of the railway line, partly just because it would make for a good thumbnail shot, but also I did want to extend out a little bit more suburbs into this area. There was one take of this road layout that I decided not to go with. It had slightly more of a winding main road and kind of seemed a little bit indirect when there were other roads that took a shorter path. So I decided to take a do-over and just created this sort of 90-degree bend that goes up the hill, maintains about a 5% grade all the way up. And then coming through and adding these other roads. So there's one road there that goes sort of in a valley between two ridges at about a 10% grade and keeps going up the hill. And then there's also this road which kind of follows the railway line a little bit closer. And this is that steep road I was talking about. Just trying to push the limits a bit more here since we are now in a properly hilly part of the city where there's not really any other options to connect all the different roads and things, and just building a cul-de-sac at the top of the ridgeline there. And then we're coming through and building this bridge over the railway line that goes to the large tunnel deviation that goes through the hill, and just trying to figure out how to connect that up, and that'll connect to other suburban areas in the future. And again, another cul-de-sac at the top of this ridgeline as well. And then a couple of final streets, and then we're going to move over to adding in some residential to this area. So this area is kind of on the bounds of where I'd like this housing set to be for the sort of 1930s style era. At least this particular section is quite flat though, so just very straightforward housing development here. But in the future I need to work out what I want to do with the other houses in this area, since I've kind of run to the limit of the special decade sets that I created, and I'm now using just some generic sets that I created a long time ago before deciding to go on that sort of very detailed decade specific architectural thing. And here just working on another sort of ridgeline of the hill, building a cul-de-sac at the top, some houses at the bottom, and then coming through and just filling the edges of the hill with trees, since it is quite steep there. As you can see, the cliff texture showing through, but I did keep the cliff texture there rather than covering it up with anything else. And then we're moving over to the back entrance to the train station, just connecting along to this road. And if you're enjoying the video thus far, make sure to leave a like. And I did also notice that with this station, I think I have the station tracks around the wrong way, as when I was looking at this after, there were pedestrians waiting on the wrong side of the tracks from where the platform is. So that's something that I need to fix up in my free time off camera. And yeah, here just coming through, adding a wall. I colored the bottom one black to kind of make it seem as though people are entering into some void, as I didn't really want to deal with the detailing below here. And then just placing some grass around the edges of this walkway. And then we come through and add in a little bit of trees and other lower vegetation around the areas. But if you've enjoyed this episode, you can also consider checking out some of the other videos on my channel. That includes an underground train station, which I think I've mentioned like once or twice in this video, as well as many other builds throughout the city. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next episode.